Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. Well, actually not all that little. This is the Damned Designs Fenrir. First off, though, in the name of full disclosure, I want to thank Damned Designs for sending this guy along. He reached out to me, said, "Hey Nick, I got a new design. Any of these interesting?" And I saw this guy with the warty blade. I was like, "Yes, actually, that is interesting. That is different." And so I asked him to send one of these guys along. But as always, I said in my full disclaimer from my website, told him I'm going to talk about the good, the great, the bad, the ugly. It might be a gem, it might be junk. He did still send it along. Nonetheless, we have to assume this is the very best quality controlled one of these guys ever. And I'm doing my best not to let this affect the nature or quality of my review. Next thing, size comparison. This is not a particularly tiny knife. I mean, first off, we'll put it up against a ruler here, and we see that it comes in at 3.25 inches or so, maybe a little bit over that line if it's legally important, or if the cop doesn't like you, right? But it is definitely it's not a tiny knife. And if we put this guy up next to the Spyderco PM2, we see here is that handle-wise, it's almost PM2 size, right? And if we put it up against our other comparison knives, the Spyderco Delica, and as always, the Ontario Rat number 2, we see here is, yeah, this is reasonably large, right? It's got a pretty beefy body to it. And actually one of the relevant point of comparison here is actually thickness. Here, I'll go ahead, I'll close it up here, and what we'll see is next to the Delica, this is a thick boy. Even next to the Spyderco PM2, this is not thin whatsoever. It's about PM2 thickness, maybe a little bit more at its widest point. It's a pretty thick boy, and it's a relatively big knife for the amount of blade you get, but nonetheless, there it is. Next thing, what the heck is Damned Designs? Well, I'll be damned. This guy is, he's based out of the States. He's a designer, but he's working with overseas factories to have these guys made. So it is really a design house that's been making a number of different models, and this is one of them, and he's actually got a bunch of versions that seem like they've got relatively similar handles but different blade shapes. So if this blade isn't, suiting you, then there are some other options here, but this is the very first time I've had one of the Damned Designs on my table here to take a look at, and this guy is about $50, and all the other versions with different different blade shapes and maybe different handles, I didn't have any of those on the table, they're all around the $50 mark, so that's good. Then finally, I'm going to go on ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this very interesting little knife right here. So on the good side, to start with, the price on this guy is pretty solid, right? $50 is a price point that I kind of like these days. Not because, generally I like to see value. I like to see, pushing down and down, but at the same time, $50 is cheap enough, is expensive enough to do things right, to use a decent steel, like, Dato to do, that they're not cutting every corner, that it's not a race to the bottom, but it's also cheap enough to be affordable to a number of people in the collecting world, right? The $50 is, I think, within reach for most people. Yeah, so I think this is a good price point. I think they did a good job right here. Next thing, there are some very nice details on this guy. One of them is the hidden lanyard hole right here. The very best thing a lanyard hole can be is missing. Well, okay, I'm sorry, is not present in any visible sense, right? And what we've got here is a hole where you can stick a lanyard through there. But if you don't see anything about it. That's a nice little detail. We also see that the clip is ambidextrous. You can move the clip to either side. And actually, the clip, one other thing that's worth noting here is that the clip is sunken down below the level of the G10, and the screws are actually flush with the G10, such that your pocket can get all the way up under this clip, which is a really nice little detail. It's a good thing, and so it makes sense that on the other side, we would have to see a filler tab. He's made a little metal filler tab with a pair of screws, and so you would just swap that around if you make the clip. So that makes this guy, although it's not ambidextrous in terms of lock, it is ambidextrous in terms of carry, which 10% of my audience is going to be very appreciative of. So that's a nice thing. I also very much appreciate the clip itself in that it is a deep carry clip, right? That means that the knife sits all the way down in the pocket such that only this much of the knife is actually going to be exposed, which can be a very nice thing for HR purposes, so to speak. That's a good thing. Next thing, this guy has a pivot here, which is quite nice. It is, the pivot itself on the backside is just plain Torx, but on this side, it has a, hexagonal sort of size to it with a nice pattern. But the most important part about this is that it keeps the pivot from spinning freely, right? As I'm turning this side won't be turning because it's inlaid into the G10 here, roughly. So I think it's a nice little detail, and it's something I do very, very much love seeing. And so that's good. Next thing, this guy has a very nice action. What we're going to see here is I'm going to brace my wrist against the table. No way I'm using any wrist force, and it deploys very reliably. I've never failed to flip on this guy. It works great. The action is good. It's the one thing I'll say say is that the blade finish is a little bit kind of scratchy as you're using it, but that'll smooth out over time as the detent ball wears in. It's a very nice action. It works well. Whoever's doing the detents is just doing them right. No problems there. And actually, generally speaking, the knife is pretty well done, right? It's a budget knife, 100%, but at the same time, for what it is, it's quite good. We see here the inlay matches pretty well. We've got this nice little area here with the shadow lines, such that everything looks like it matches up effectively. The clip is well done. All the finishing is. This is just a pretty well-made knife for $50. I'm pretty impressed, actually, in terms of build quality and things like that. And then finally, on the good side, I like the blade on this guy. This is a Wharncliffe-style blade, which means it has a flat bottom to it. This is a knife that has, well, not a whole lot of curvature. There is a little bit of curvature, as we see there on the very tip. It does lift off a little bit, but at the same time, a Wharncliffe blade is very nice for a couple of reasons. Not the least of which is there are many cutting tasks, like going into a box or something where just having that little tiny tip trailing is really, really effective. These are just very good for like closed cell foam. There are a whole subset of cutting tasks at which Wharncliffes are very, very good. Not particularly good for like food prep and things like that, because you have to kind of press it down against the table or something like that. But they are quite, I mean, and they can be. You just need to have the blade lower than the handle, and it's not here. But anyways, I digress. It's just a really nice blade shape, and it's also very attractive. And it's a little bit different, right? There were lots of $50 D2 frame or liner locks in the world. Not that many with this kind of a blade shape, which is why I went there. It's also got another, other little details like a good sharpening choil here. It's D2 steel, which is a solid budget steel. And it's got a reasonably thin edge on this guy, despite having very thick blade stock, which I appreciate too. Overall, I gotta say, I like the blade on this guy. Not just the Warnie, but the rest of it's done pretty well. So to me, all that's the good is it's got a nice Warnie blade. It's generally pretty well done with a solid action, a nice pivot here design, a deep carry ambi clip with a flush filler tab, the hidden Lanyard. It's kind of like a lanyard hole, but I don't even know. Who knows? Just get a better reviewer now. And the price is pretty reasonable, being both cheap enough to be affordable, but also there's enough there to do it right and not race to the bottom. On the great front to me, actually, is just the design overall. Right, there are too many of these modern pieces, especially coming out of overseas factories and OEMs, that feel like they were kind of designed by a committee, right? Or that the blade and the handle don't really have any connection. There aren't things like matching lines. There aren't things like symmetries. It just doesn't really work all that well together. It feels like it was knocked out in an afternoon by somebody who was combining an existing blade with an existing handle, and there's not much cohesiveness. Whereas with this guy, I really feel like somebody spent a lot of time, well, presumably Damned Designs spent a lot of time thinking about this guy. You get lines that are flowing together. You get lots of little details. The whole thing feels very cohesive, and it feels very designed, right? This is a company that has design right in the title, and as a result, they better be doing design well. Even like, look, for instance, right here. If we look at the G10 here, we see that actually the pattern of the G10 is reflected in the pivot and vice versa. We get facets coming off the pivot here individually. This is a little thing, but it's a thing that makes me feel like this was done by a designer who cared about this design rather than this was done by somebody who was told they needed to come up with 3 knives this week, right? And I really do appreciate that. And that's one of the things that makes this guy stand out, is that very nice, relatively cohesive design. On the bad side, there are some downsides here. I mean, to start with, as I said, this isn't a perfectly flat Wharncliffe blade. There is that little area at the tip here where it kind of comes off of the Warnie. This isn't a major issue, but it does mean that if you are sharpening on a flat stone, you're going to have to use a slightly modified stroke rather than just going directly across the stone back and forth. Not the end of any worlds, but it is something you want to keep in mind. Next thing, the blade stock on this guy is a little bit thicker than I feel like it needs to be. Like I said, they narrow it down to a nice thin edge, and it's reasonably tall, so it works out. But I hate to see this really thick blade stock being in use. It just doesn't seem to make all that much sense to me. Because, honestly, the next thing is this is a thick boy, right? This knife is thick. If we take a look at this guy with a ruler here, I'm sure there are better measurements online, but this guy is coming in not so far, it's a little bit past ½ an inch, right? This is a thick knife in the pocket, and it's also relatively heavy. If I throw this guy on a scale here, we're going to see is this guy's coming in at 4.45 ounces. That's a lot, right? That's a fair amount for 3¼ inches of blade, right? So as a result, this is a very bulky knife. And that, again, that's something you can deal with, and that's what you get when you do this much contouring and whatnot on the G10. But at the same time, it is a thick and heavy boy here. Next thing, the lock bar on this guy, this little portion right here, is unfortunately a little bit proud of the scales. If I look at this guy directly vertically, what we see is that these little bits of jimping here from this little lock bar are sticking up. So as a result, as you're gripping this guy, you are actually feeling that little set of lock bar jimps, if you will, digging into your fingers a little bit. Is this a big deal? No, not particularly, but it does mean that ergonomically speaking, this is not an incredibly great choice. It's okay. And in fact, if they were to fix this area here with the lock bar and they were to fix the clip, it would be pretty decent in the hand with all this contouring, but that is definitely a major downside here. I would have preferred that this part here be a little bit lower into the handle, and then they scallop this side out just a little bit more to allow that kind of access. Lock bar access is very good, but at the same time, I just don't care for having the lock bar proud of the liners in this particular way. Then finally, as I mentioned earlier, this little area on the clip is to me a loss, right? Because it makes sense, right? You can get into these screws very straightforwardly, but at the same time, yeah. The problem with doing it that way is that then you end up with these extra bulges, and you definitely feel these bulges as you are gripping this knife. It just adds extra corners to this guy that I really don't particularly appreciate. So I feel like they could have done well with a slightly thicker clip overall to allow those holes to be in there with one consistent surface here. Or maybe if they had done, just a hole for the driver bit and then shorter screws, just this particular solution just adds a bunch more edge to the knife. Not edge, but, a gripping edge that I don't really feel like it needs to have. So to me, at least, that's what's bad, is that the bulges on the clip are not a very good idea. The lock bar is proud, and that means poor ergonomics. Well, not poor, but like I said, it's aside from that, Miss Lincoln, how was the play ergonomics, right? Everything else is good except this and this, but these are not good. So as a result, the whole thing kind of suffers a little bit. Fix that, ergos are great. It is heavy, it's a thick boy. The blade is thicker than it needs to be, and it's not a perfectly flat warning. On the ugly front, there's really nothing ugly here. The design may be polarizing for some, but honestly, I think it's fine. So let's go to the final conclusion, which is that it is, unsurprisingly, fine. A fine little budget choice here, honestly. Because it's coming in, I feel like it's coming in at a pretty decent price, right? It's got some nice details, a solid action. It's got a deep carry clip on there. It's got good construction. Overall, a nice warty blade and a design that feels like it's got some careful thought in an era where so many of the budget choices feel careless, or at least very scattershot. The blade has a little unexpected curve to it. It's a little thick. The knife is overall a little thick. It's a bit heavy with a proud lock bar and a bulging clip for some reason. Ultimately, I think there is room for some improvement and iteration here, particularly right here and in the clip direction. But at this price, I don't know that they're required to hit that, that point. If they were asking $80 for this, yeah, it's getting a little much, but you know what? I'm reasonably okay with this. This is more than good enough as it stands to be a solid daily tool. And particularly if you're often using gloves or something like that make the ergonomics not a concern for you, then honestly, this is going to be fine. My general feeling, though, in terms of final conclusion, is that this is a knife where the design is going to make the choice for you, right? Because there are about 1 million D2 liner locks for around $50 or less these days in the market, right? That is a flooded market segment, with 10 more releasing every day, and you probably can't tell those 10 apart, but hey, whatever, they're out there. And some of them are even cheaper, and some are lacking a couple little downsides here. But the problem is, very often, like I said, the designs tend to feel careless. They tend to feel scattershot, and they certainly aren't as, unified and as well thought out as this guy is. So ultimately, I feel like you're going to look at this guy, and if you don't love the design, then don't buy this knife, right? There's really nothing that unique for you here, although there aren't that many warnies is another thing to consider, right? The number of reasonably made budget Warncliffe knives with a big old blade is reasonably low. But nonetheless, if you're not loving the design or the blade, there's just not that much reason to go here. But if you're liking the design vibes, then honestly, I think this is going to be a damn good choice. You'll be howling with enjoyment because it's the Fenrir. No, it'll be low-key a great child of your collecting because Fenrir is a child of Loki. No? A little bit of Norse mythology for you? Okay, anyways, I'm trying too damn hard. I hope this has been interesting to you and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.